With that, I'm pleased to welcome our first speaker, Suman Sinha. He is the founder and CEO of ReNew Power, one of the largest developers of solar and wind farms in India. Today, he's going to be discussing the company's efforts to accelerate the development of renewables in that nation and the particular challenges that India faces as it strives to create a cleaner power sector in a fast expanding economy where electricity demands are set to skyrocket. Welcome, Suman.
Yeah, hello, James, and thank you so much for having me on your program.
Of course. Thank you so much for being here. The stage is now yours, and I'm really looking forward to your presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, James. You've set the stage very nicely. I think you've talked about the real urgency of the situation with respect to climate change and the causation of carbon dioxide and how imperative it is for us to really move forward rapidly. Before I talk about the imperative of the energy transition, let me say a little bit about our company. I'm the chairman and CEO of ReNew Power, which is India's largest renewable energy company. We generate 1% of India's total electricity production, and so far help mitigate about 0.5% of total carbon emissions. We have more than 110 sites all across different parts of India, and we generate close to about megawatts of clean energy. Now, you talked about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and the reality is that the bulk of that comes from energy, and energy in all its manifestations. And I'll talk about really where we are right now. You referred to just about a degree centigrade temperature already happened, and this chart really does illustrate that we're already at about 1.1 degrees centigrade, and the trajectory is not good because obviously, as you also said, carbon dioxide works with a lag. And so all the carbon dioxide that we've been spewing into the atmosphere right now is going to start impacting temperature change as we go forward. And so the IPCC report, which came out recently, essentially has said that a 1.5 degrees centigrade temperature change by 2030 is pretty much baked into the situation. Irrespective of what we do now, I doubt that it's going to impact, bring that 1.5 degrees centigrade number down. And the number of the changes that this is going to cause are irreversible. And so therefore, we are looking at a very different future compared to what we have lived in our lifetimes so far in terms of weather and climatic conditions and so on. So the situation is really quite dire at this point in time. And the reality is that, countries around the world are just not doing enough. And so there is, of course, a lot of talk, which unfortunately Greta Thunberg at a recent youth climate conference said, blah, 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 which unfortunately in some ways does reflect the feeling that a lot of people have that there's more talk, less action. And in fact, when you add up all the climate change pledges that have happened, you see that we are well shy of meeting the goals that we need to get to essentially keep temperature change below 1.5 degrees centigrade. And if you just add up all the NDCs that have been committed so far, we're looking at a 0.5 degrees centigrade temperature change. And that is why COP26 at Glasgow is so critical, because there is obviously the expectation and the hope that, in fact, the world is able to come together and at least do whatever needs to be done, not to let it get too far ahead of 1.5 degrees centigrade and keep it as close to that as possible. But unfortunately, there are enough climate naysayers still left in the world in fairly influential countries. And that really is the big problem area for us. Now, coming to the role of India, because that's really the thing that I intend to talk about. No decarbonization pathway, unfortunately, in the world, can work if you don't go through India. And the reason essentially is that India today accounts for 8% of carbon emissions. And of course, China and the US are significantly higher. India is already more than the European Union, which is less. But unfortunately, India as a country is growing very rapidly. And therefore, carbon emissions are also likely to grow. So if we follow the path that every single economy that has taken before us, which is a carbon intensive path, then this 8% number can become 15% and 20% quite soon. And so all the are being put into markets and countries like the European Union or even in the US for that matter will come to naught, simply because countries like India and other emerging market countries that still have the growth imperative ahead of them, unfortunately, continue to pursue growth for their economy, for their people, and therefore leads to the problem that will become more accentuated in the future. Now, the point that I was making earlier is that energy in India accounts for almost 70% of total carbon emissions. And within energy, there are basically three blocks: electricity, industries, and transportation that account for almost 75-80% or more of the total carbon emissions. And so, therefore, we have to find ways of dealing with these industries. And this is not a truth for India, this is a truth globally. We have to find solutions. So, the question is, where are we on trying to find solutions to these issues right now in India? Now, the issue is, unfortunately, the point I was making earlier, India's per capita electricity consumption, just to take that one sector out of the energy basket, uh, is only one third the global average. And the global average itself gets pulled down because India is a sixth of the global population. If you take India out, then we are actually a quarter of the rest of the world's average. And so we have a long way to grow and a long way to go. And the forecasts essentially are that India will add a power system equal to the size of the European Union's current power system over the next 20 to 25 years to itself. And so, as all of that power generating capacity comes on stream, the question is, what form will that power generation take? And this is where the news is positive. India already is very far advanced along the renewable energy track. We have close to about 100 gigawatts of total renewable energy capacity already in the country. And now renewables have become fundamentally much cheaper than any other source of electricity. And so, my view is that as far as the electricity sector is concerned, technologies are now available uh, to essentially decarbonize the electricity part of the energy basket. It's just implementing these solutions at scale and implementing them really, really rapidly. And that is something that has, of course, a lot of problems in itself because you need land, you need grid and transmission connectivity, you need the intermittency of renewables to be managed, but and of course, you need financing. But the reality is that given the size of the sector and given the size of the opportunity, a lot of players are coming in, and there is more and more capital also that is identified. The whole energy transition as being fundamentally critical, and therefore there is capital coming in as well. And because of the commercial implications, the buyers of power clearly want to buy renewable electricity. The one thing that still needs to come into play here is obviously the issue of managing the intermittency. And that is something that chances are those technologies again are there. They just have to be scaled up at a commercially more attractive rate. And if that happens over the next 3 to 5 years, you'll probably find that at least the electricity part of the energy value chain can get addressed over the next 5 to 10 years, where entire economies, and India, for example, among them, will move primarily more and more towards renewable electricity and over by 2040 become entirely renewable energy oriented. And so I think that's really good news. So that's at least one part of the problem that looks like it can get solved quite quickly. Now, the government of India has been very, very active in propagating renewable energy. There are a number of policies that they've come out with. And in fact, they've set a target of getting up to 450 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030, up from the current installed capacity of 100 gigawatts. So it's a four and a half times growth in the next 10 years in a fairly rapid growth. And this is, by the way, something that India has already announced publicly in various global forums and so on. So clearly, something that we definitely intend to pursue further. And the government has come out with a number of policy steps that favor the installation of renewable energy in the electricity mix going forward. Uh, Mobility is the other big area. Transportation. In transportation, we're obviously seeing electric vehicles as emerging as a solution. For public transportation, fuel cells powered by hydrogen is another solution. But unfortunately, at least in India, we don't yet have an electric vehicle mandate. So we haven't said that by 2030, for example, a certain percentage of all of our electric vehicles or vehicles should be electric in nature. We have not come out of those mandates yet. And that's partly because the domestic automotive industry is resisting those calls because obviously that will require significant investments and also stranded assets in terms of the investments already made. So this is an area that certainly needs to be pushed forward much faster if India has to make progress. Also, we don't have charging stations. That's a big lacuna or gap There's no strategy behind that. And technologies, we don't have any battery manufacturing capacity in India as well. And so this is an area where we need to actually do a lot more work before I think we can say that this area is effectively tackled. Now, moving on, the one other thing that is emerging again globally and in India as well as a real is the area of green hydrogen. And why I say it's a hope is because uh, green hydrogen has this ability of taking renewable electricity into the broader energy domain. And as we saw, the non-electricity part of the energy value chain is almost about 50-60%. And so if we are able to take renewable hydro or green hydrogen made through cracking water using renewable energy, then that really allows us to extend into a much broader part of the entire energy ecosystem, and allows us to get into hard to abate sectors, for example, steel, cement, refining, fertilizers, etc., that today we don't have solutions for. Now, today hydrogen is still green hydrogen is still expensive, uh, but there's a lot of work going on, and everybody has this thing in their minds that if solar costs came down so dramatically through investments in technology research and further scale, can the same thing happen to hydrogen? And that is why everybody in the world seems to be putting a lot of effort behind green hydrogen, and that's really become a very significant effort now, especially in India. And keep in mind that India imports almost $160 billion of energy through fuel imports every year. If green hydrogen made domestically allows us to start replacing a lot of that through electric vehicles and fuel cells on the mobility side, and also replaces LNG or natural gas on the areas where that is used, then effectively we have the opportunity as an economy of significantly curtailing our imports of energy, and that for the Indian economy can be a very significant game changer, which is why the government of India has announced a national green hydrogen mission, and basically is putting a lot of effort behind ensuring that pilots are set up, that manufacturing capacity gets set up for electrolyzers domestically, and that hydrogen really gets gets a solid push, and costs are brought down, and mandates are brought in for users of gray hydrogen to switch to green hydrogen. So this is an area which is really being pushed quite hard. Now, the other thing that India does not done yet very significantly is invest in the manufacturing ecosystem, because all of this capacity, it's not good enough for us to replace oil imports with solar panel imports, because you're just replacing one kind of energy dependency on another kind of energy dependency with very significantly different geostrategic sort of implications. And so the government has taken a view that this entire green economy or green ecosystem needs to essentially be manufactured in India. And that's actually a good thing, because even though the cost may be a little bit on the higher side to begin with, as scale emerges in India, and given the fact that India is going to be investing such large amounts in renewable energy, and that doesn't even incorporate green hydrogen and so on, which is going to make the scale even larger, there are very few, we'll probably be the second or third largest green economy in the world. And by setting up manufacturing ecosystem, India can actually emerge as an alternative supplier of green equipment to China, which today is really the only alternative, because China exports or manufactures almost 90% of the world's solar panels, polysilicon, wafers, etc., and is probably going to move to a similar level in terms of batteries as well. And so the world is getting unhealthily dependent on just and that kind of supply chain dependency is not really good. So I think India has the opportunity of emerging as an alternative manufacturing destination for the green economy. Now, in solar, India brought down tariffs and duties in the beginning, created the demand on the back of imports. And once that demand creation happened, then we've jacked up the import duties, put in a manufacturing capital subsidy scheme. And on the back of that, there were applications for almost 50,000 megawatts of solar panel manufacturing capacities being put under that manufacturing scheme. And so really, therefore, it's a fairly good process that the government set up for that. Now, the same can be done for batteries, for electrolyzers, and for fuel cells. And we can replicate the same kind of a general process to get in much more deeply into the manufacturing side. So in conclusion, and I know that I've gone very rapidly over all of this, climate change, of course, is a critical imperative. Current efforts are not good enough. And India, I think, given the size of the economy, given our growth in the future, has to play an absolutely critical role in finding solutions towards carbon light or carbon free growth, and really leapfrogging into a green economy from our current situation. And this is also, therefore, a great opportunity for India to establish a leadership position and also, serve as, in some ways, a beacon for other emerging market countries to follow as well. And so India really has a very critical role to play in this whole issue of decarbonization. And therefore, the government is moving fast. We as private players are moving fast. Capital is coming in. So it's a very exciting sector full of opportunities and things that we absolutely must do very, very, very quickly. Thank you, James. Back to you.
Thank you so much for that. That was a really interesting presentation. I did a story a couple years ago where I'd interviewed you, and a point that you had made for that piece was that, as rapidly as India was adding renewables, it still wasn't going to eat into the market share of coal plants, and that emissions were going to continue to rise sharply, in part because, as I said at the beginning, and as you mentioned, India's economy is just expanding so rapidly, and the number of people being, whose homes are being connected and businesses are being connected to electricity is rising sharply. So I'm curious, given the realities and the necessity of this economic growth, but also the rising dangers of climate change, which will be particularly acute within India, how do you think about the issue of, how the world as a whole should be addressing climate change? What's the right kind of fair division of responsibilities between countries like India and richer nations with longer histories of climate pollution and much, bigger cumulative pollution over the last century or so?
James, you've asked me a question that better men than me have spent many, many years negotiating over. And so
Right.
I'm not sure that I can give you an exact answer to that. I can give you only a point of view.
Sure.
And that really is the following, that, I think this whole conversation about whose responsibility it is, and therefore what should India do? Should we take a step back and wait for the Western world, which has done most of the polluting, and now China, of course, is doing the same? Should we just wait for them to take action? And my view on that is that, look, it doesn't even matter what happened in the past. Okay, in some ways, what matters is really the future, and there. The reality is that climate change is very urgent and pressing. And there's going to be a massive economy created around. If you look at the size of investment required, it's going to be maybe $2.5 to $3 trillion every year globally in investing in all sorts of green areas. Now, there are going to be massive winners and losers in this. This is, a much, much bigger industry than oil and gas ever was. Mm-hmm. And how massively that industry shaped geopolitics. Oil was data was the new oil, which meant that oil at one point was the old oil, right? Now, forget all of that. The new green economy is going to replace all of that. Now, countries like India have a choice. We can be winners in that new emerging world order, or we can take a step back and keep saying, it wasn't our fault. Don't come and look at us, etc., etc. Or we can lean into the transition and take advantage of it and create industries that become truly global champions over a period of time. And because of the size of the Indian economy, because of the head start we already have on renewables, we actually have the ability of doing that. Now, that's a very sort of personal view, right? If you ask the government, of course, they'll say that, look, this is common but differentiated responsibilities, right? And those guys, the people who polluted have a higher obligation to clean up, And there was $100 billion per year promised to emerging market countries. Where is that money? And so, you get stuck in all of those kinds of arguments, unfortunately. Right. So it's a little bit antiquated, but that's the reality of the situation.
Got it. You had mentioned, and of course this is recognized throughout the world, that the cost of renewables is plummeting. So I am curious about the dynamics of new power sector development in India today. What does the competition look like between when there's a choice between building a new power plant, whether it's going to be a coal plant or renewables plants like the ones that your company is building, does it still look like there will be a lot of new coal construction going forward? And if so, why? What's sustaining that sector even as renewables become more competitive?
It's very simple, James. The issue really is right now that India's power demand is growing at about 5 to 6% every year. And over the next 10 years, 12 years, by let's say 2030, we'll need, if we were to meet all the new power demand through renewables only, we'll need maybe 600 to 650,000 megawatts of additional renewable energy capacity. We simply can't add capacity that fast. Setting up an additional 350,000 megawatts of renewables in the next 10 years is equal to replicating the total capacity in India from all power generating sources set up from all of India's history. So to do that only in renewables in the next 10 years, it's a very, very tall order. So the reality is that, we just can't simply go any faster. I think there are physical, natural constraints to growing faster than that. Therefore, you will have to have more coal-based plants, a coal-based power capacity being there. Now, the issue, because otherwise India will actually have to compromise on growth, which is not something that I think any government is going to be able to afford. The issue, however, is that today, the countervailing issue is that nobody wants to invest in new coal plants. Nobody wants to give debt financing to new coal plants. And so therefore, it's unlikely that you'll see new coal plants actually getting started. But those that are already in the works, those will get completed. And the plant load factors of existing coal plants in India is only about 55%. So that will go up. And so you will have more coal power coming in, but not any new coal capacity being constructed in all likelihood. So I think that's what's going to end up happening. And so the market share of coal will go down from the current 65-70% down to about 50% by 2030. And by 2040, probably down to about 20%. But it won't go away altogether in the next 10 years for sure.
Okay. You had mentioned the challenges of intermittency. I'm curious, what does that challenge look like today, given this rapid ramp up we've seen of renewables in India, particularly with the state of India's transmission and distribution systems? I'm curious what that picture is looking like, and how do you see those problems being addressed as that share continues to rise? Are we starting to see more discussions around grid scale battery systems or other sorts of consistent sources of clean electricity being built?
Yeah, that's obviously the big question. Now the issue is that our sense is that today renewables is only 10% of the grid of total power generation capacity. And not capacity, I mean in terms of actual power generating units. And that number is likely to go up to 20% or thereabouts before intermittency becomes a real problem for the grid to manage. So there is some way to grow, but by 2030, renewables will be about 30-35%. And so certainly the intermittency issue will have to be dealt with by that time. Now, the government is doing a number of different things. First of all, capacity is being built out at a pretty furious pace. So that is not going to be a problem. On the grid management side, simply because if you have so much solar coming in the middle of the day, it's obviously going to lead to the usual duck curve problem, which therefore has to be addressed in some way, shape, or form. Now, so the government is trying a number of. We've bid out actually firm renewable energy bids, which require us to deliver an 80% plant load factor using only renewable energy and batteries, and that has been bid out at a cost of about 20% cheaper than coal-based power. And so that gives hope that in the future, you will be able to have more of those kinds of bids, which are able to compete with coal in terms of its base loadish nature, but are significantly cheaper as well. And as the cost of batteries keeps coming down over the next several years, I think this issue of intermittency will find another big weapon or tool to help it being addressed. And so I'm pretty convinced in my mind that between a mix of better grid management, better combinations of renewable energy and storage, and the cost reduction of storage, which will allow us to have more batteries in the system, this problem of intermittency eventually will be solved. But there will be some stop and starts along the way. But the technology does exist to solve this problem.
Okay. You had mentioned the importance of India, not just building out its own electricity generation, clean electricity generation, but building up its own green domestic manufacturing sector. And I'm just curious, how does that effort stand today? Are you starting to see that industry take hold and start to grow notably today?
Yeah, so we're at the very infancy of that thought process and that effort right now, James. So wind turbines are almost entirely manufactured in India for domestic consumption. They're also exported from India. Solar panels, as I said, we've just had a manufacturing bid to apply for the CapEx subsidy, and 55,000 megawatts of bids were received, which will have to get opened, which will have to get allocated, and some part of that capacity will come up. We'll have to wait and see how much exactly. And I think going to be then leading on to other things, batteries manufacturing eventually, and then electrolyzer manufacturing as well. So I think all of that will happen sequentially. Solar panel manufacturing, I think, comes first.
Right. Okay. Well, with that, we are out of time. So thank you so much, Suman. We really appreciate you joining us here at EmTech today.
Thank you so much, James, for having me on the show.